Hello, everyone. This is Miss Kia, and I have decided to do a rendition of a podcast on the first two chapters of our book, Educational Administration Theories, Research, and Practice. So, I will talk about the origins of theory and research, the system's perspective from history, from its beginnings into now, the school as a social system, the technical core of school systems, behavioral, cognitive, and constructivist perspectives of learning. And then throughout, I will go through some practical applications that were outlined in the book to kind of give you guys something maybe to talk about or kind of springboard the conversation from this new endeavor that I have tried here. So please be easy on me. This is brand new for me. I wanted to try something that I have never done before. So yeah, be easy on me. So we will start with chapter 1 and how the school is a social system. It's chapter 1 started with a broad view of talking about what a theory is and science, and I really enjoyed the metaphor that they used about it being like a conversation, and that kind of went throughout that part of the chapter. And so one quote that really stuck with me is the idea of science being a conversation between rigor and imagination, and then the way they framed a theory as a special language that explains different truths or occurrences. And so they also went even further in that conversation or storytelling to talk about how in that within that theory, in that special language, your vocabulary is going to be the concepts and how they are framed and defined, and then your grammar throughout that conversation or language is the generalizations that are made. And so these generalizations, the vocabulary, the language around a theory tells a story of why things happen the way that they do. And so, how that kind of marries with research is that when you test this story or this phenomenon in different contexts, you see if the story will fit in these different kinds of contexts. And that's how you come up with your hypothesis, which is a statement that describes the relationships between different variables. So your research is really testing those hypotheses or those relationships, and seeing if those stories come together and if a theory can actually be formed because those stories work in different contexts. So the way that it was kind of explained within the book is in the part where it talks about how we think, which was kind of introduced by Dewey, and it kind of made me think of the scientific method and how we will identify a problem and then kind of have some concepts or some generalizations about it. That's when you form your hypothesis, and then you kind of test it and see if it works and if it doesn't and what conclusions you can draw. And so that is kind of the basis of, I guess, the entire book, and all of the concepts that we're going to use or going to talk about. They have this foundation of theory, and the most important part I think to glean from this part is that theories have to be useful. Like, they have to be something that can be used, that can be tested, that can be either explained or disagreed with, but they have to have some kind of use. They can't just be kind of out there and not something that is provable at all. And so then our book goes into some different perspectives of systems work. So the first thing that is asked is whether a system is open or closed. And so the argument is that no one system can be closed off from itself. There's no way that any one system can be self sustaining or have no influence from anything outside of that system. And so every system, this book posits, and I believe that it is true, is open um, in some kind of way. So the history, they started with rational systems model, which uses a machine metaphor and kind of the cogs in the wheel. It has a top down pyramid shape because it is based on the division of labor. It's based on standardization and the homogeneous groups, and kind of, you work here, you specialize in this, and I oversee you. And then each specialization gets overseen, and then all of these cogs kind of work together to make the organization work. That is the history. In today, that rational model is still very much influenced in organizations because of, strategic planning, your goal orientation, having goals, and moving to meet those goals is definitely part of that rational model and part of what is used in organizational theory and thought today. Also, formalization is part of that. So, having formal structures, having roles, having expected parts or expected behaviors within those roles and how those roles interact, those structures that are set in organizations. All of that is part of the rational model. So the rational systems model is one, which has a machine metaphor. The next one is an organism metaphor that talks about how groups adapt and survive together. And that is called the natural systems model. So this is the beginnings of this in history was the human relationship approach. And the most important studies that go with that are the Hawthorne studies. I actually talked about the Hawthorne effect in the Hawthorne studies in Dr. Flores' class last semester. And so that was about manipulating some variables. The most important one was the lights and how the workers' productivity, even though the hypothesis was, or the thought was, that their productivity was going to lessen when they had less light and the conditions weren't as favorable. But actually, with the unfavorable conditions, they still, even with the control group, there was still increased productivity. And that was based on the informal organizations, or the informal values and norms and communication and culture within that system. And it's its own like social structure that's kind of not part of the, when in school there's a, principal, assistant principal, teachers, students. But within every school there are also informal structures. Some teachers have some more power than others based on some politics and different interactions and how they adapt and survive. So the Hawthorne studies were part of and early human relation studies were part of the foundation. Today, we do talk about how social groups adapt and survive, and the whole, I think, department or thought about how human resources is a part of every organization kind of came out of this natural systems model and the organism metaphor. Um, Then it goes on to talk about the open system, which includes the natural and the rational model, and talks about the interactions of inputs, the processes, and the outputs within an organization. Those processes have to be transformational. So the inputs, the money, the different things that come into the organization are transformed, and then outputs are a part of that. So some of the elements of that included a continual feedback loop or an opportunity for correction, that each organization has boundaries there are parts of the organization that are walled off from the environment, or maybe be more insulated from the influence of the environment, even though the environment is going to influence some parts of every organization for sure. Sometimes those boundaries aren't as clear. Um, Homeostasis, which means that every organization is going to try to come to some kind of equilibrium. For instance, in a school, if the state legislature passes new laws, then the schools have to adjust and come to, every organization is going to try to come to some equilibrium and try to get back to a balanced state, no matter what the environment changes are. And a great this makes me think so much about the years of COVID in school, and how COVID was the thing that just kind of hit us out of the blue, and we had to make some major adjustments to get to a point. And I don't know that we've ever got to equilibrium as an organizations in schools with that, but um, I think we're still actually trying to get to equilibrium now from some of the effects of it, even years later. But those are parts or elements of um, the open system. And so these systems kind of help us understand and come to the conclusion that a school, is a social system. So it has a defined structure, it has roles and expectations based on positions. Each individual is a person in and of themselves. They have their own goals, their own dreams, their own aspirations within the system. And so that has to also be taken into consideration. Each school has an identity, has norms, has traditions, those things that make up their culture. And there's also a little bit of politics that's a part of that. It's interesting how this text actually talked about how politics, in a mostly negative connotation. So it talked about how politics was a thing that was kind of an underlying or nefarious look at how individuals or groups within an organization can try to grab power. Another part of the school being a social system is the technical core, or the central purpose of the school and the environment. The outside forces and feedback also is part of how the school is a social system. So, all of those parts, if you notice, they all come from the different systems perspectives. So, you have little parts of the rational systems, the goal orientation, the formalization, and the structure. You have part of the natural systems model, where you talk about the human resources and individuals and cultures and the feedback. So that is all a part of this understanding of how the school is a social system. So then this book also kind of goes into a very interesting story that really kind of caught my attention. So, the streaking. And it was so interesting to me how this story was kind of weaved into this social system. And at first I was like, well, I don't understand. This kind of seems a little bit out of place. But when you think about the underlying assumptions and the needs and the different systems and how they interact, and how specific roles and specific people have different ideas, and how those can come into they can kind of butt heads. And so, and it also speaks to policy, and should this student been treated this way. There's all kinds of different parts to this story that I thought were fascinating and really brought home a lot of the parts of this chapter. So that is the conclusion of chapter 1. I'm going to briefly go into chapter 2 and how the technical core, the teaching and learning, the core, the purpose of schools is having students learn through very sound and um, great teaching. And so, learning is defined in this book as the experience that produces change in knowledge and behavior. So, there's three different perspectives that this book really kind of focused on. And the first one was the behavioral perspective and the use of behavioral theory. So they talked about functional behavior assessment, the good behavior game, learning objectives, and direct instruction as part of the underlying theory behind these types of instruction or programs is behavioral theory. And so this is really talking about how we look at students and their behavior. We see that there is something that happens or triggers that behavior, then the behavior happens, and then there is a consequence. So that's kind of that ABC that goes with functional behavior assessment. I was very pleased to see the functional behavior assessment and the PBS, the positive behavior support, as part of this. Um, One of the important things that I think that this chapter really honed on that I think is missed in a lot of schools is that the positive behavior support is reteaching and teaching students replacement behaviors that have the same function as the negative behavior that we're trying to stop. And I think that is so important because I think sometimes we just think about positive behavior support as this is how we want them to act, but we don't go into how the what the function is of the undesired behavior is and how we can replace that effectively. I think that's kind of missing, and so that was really something that I enjoyed reading and looking at. And it's always good to get reviews and reminders about the differences between positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and punishment, and direct punishment and removal punishment. It's always important to understand those distinctions. In the cognitive perspective, it was based on the information processing model, and I think it again has some things that have been basics in most education preparation courses, but still, we need those reminders about sensory memory, how working memory works, and long term memory. And our understanding of those three things bring about different ways that we can teach and reach students who are having breakdowns in these three areas. And so, um, just the idea of in sensory memory, making sure that students have attention and giving them interventions and things that they can do to help them understand and pay attention, to build on previous knowledge to increase their perception. And then within working memory, having that chunking and the rehearsal to help students hold that information and manipulate it in that short period of time. And then long-term memory, when we think about the images and supporting students in developing that schema through metacognition, notes, visuals, mnemonics, elaboration, helping them organize their thinking and put their thinking in context. And actually, that's kind of what Dr. Christian is doing with the different ways that we are sharing and interacting with this information. We are also using our metacognition and using different ways to interact and review this information so that we make sure that it goes into long term memory. The last thing is the constructivist approach. And this is where the learners are the active participants, and it really develops and talks about the social interactions and how knowledge is constructed. In Piaget's world, the knowledge is constructed internally, and this is the manipulation and adding of what is already known, discovery learning, those kinds of things. External, where knowledge comes from outside and it's direct instruction or behavior manipulation for the student, that is the information processing that I reviewed earlier. And then Vygotsky, um, and I tend to believe this too, that he believed that it's both external and internal. So the outside world and internal discovery are what makes learning stick for students. And so it also went into problem-based learning, where students are confronted with a problem and solve it, and cooperative learning, where you do jigsaws and things like Kagan strategies, and how important this is for ELL students and for students with disabilities who may need more social interaction and talking about it as part of this constructivist approach. All right, guys. So that was a review of chapters 1 and 2. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to your comments and suggestions. Thank you.